Well, thank you very much, Dr. Andy, and what a great introduction, and it's really, really good to see you. Hi, Professor Perry. 57 participants so
Afternoon.
far and people still coming through. How are you?
Oh, it's great. Very good day here in Malaysia. So looking forward to talking about some of the challenges that the industry is facing and things on the way forward. And lots of news that's rolling out around the world as well in terms of how different destinations and countries are dealing with COVID and getting tourism back up and running.
Fantastic, absolutely. The presentation today, everybody, is a little bit about restarting tourism. And as Perry said, he's going to speak a little bit about the general scenario across the globe, and I'll speak about a case study in Australia and how restaurants and food operators are starting to reopen their businesses. But once again, without academic partners, LPU, UST, Macau, the Macau Tourism and Hospitality its association, and NKUHT, our four major sponsors. Thank you again for a great sponsorship of the show, and we look forward to a continued and ongoing relationship with all of you.
Yes, absolutely. We really do want to thank all those organisations for being part of this network. It's a growing network of institutions and students from many different countries. And that's something we're looking forward to drive forward. This was an initiative that happened before the COVID. So I like to regard this as one of the silver linings to COVID. It's forced us to do things a bit differently, to approach things a little bit differently, to connect students. Myself, Alan and Dr. Andy had often given guest lectures and presentations at different universities. So it's great to actually be able to reach out to students at many different universities at the same time.
Fantastic, and I see the technology is really starting to be commonplace with you, Perry. You're getting very comfortable with it. You've got a different presentation today.
Yes, yeah, a little bit of a different backdrop we've got here, and also thanks to some AirPods that have come along as well, allows me to get a little bit further away from the screen. And I found so much of the time I was hunching over the screen. I see Dr. Andy's there got a really nice microphone that he's installed. So I thought I'd go with the AirPods and do things a little bit differently this time.
And as Dr. Andy mentioned, everybody, before, a news segment on the show today, 90 seconds, reopening. He has a great little news article. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello, I'm Dr. Andy Nazarechuk. Welcome to 90 Seconds. This segment is designed to share the latest tourism news from around the world. Each week, we will share one popular topic that is making an impact on our industry. Today's businesses are slowly reopening, but with many restrictions on the number of customers they are allowed to have in their operations. This means reduced numbers of customers and revenues. How will they survive? In the past, cafes and bars would offer promotions to entice their customers to spend time in their operations. One very popular promotion, which we all love, is happy hour, where we would pay for one drink, but we would get two. Today's cafes and bars cannot afford such promotions and need their customers' support in order to survive. In Belgium, they have created Helpy Hour, which is designed to allow customers to financially support their favorite cafes and bars. What is Helpy Hour? Well, you pay the price for two drinks, but you only get one drink. This concept will help businesses increase their revenues during this slow reopening period, and one way for their customers to support them. The Federation of Belgian Cafes estimates that without support, 50% of the 12,000 cafes and bars in Belgium will not survive. Many countries are watching Helpy Hour very closely, and if successful, will implement similar programs very quickly. Thanks, that's all for today's 90 seconds.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Andy, and I think what a great start to a new segment. Let's hope that this is a continued feature of the 30-minute talk shows. And without much further ado, Professor Perry Hobson, would you like to start today's show off? I know you've got some very interesting stuff to share with us.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Andy, for your 90 seconds. That's an interesting start. I think you missed your calling there as doing TV shows and radio. So look, I think that's a really nice way of encapsulating some interesting issues from around the world, because so many different organizations, countries are having to deal with this COVID situation, and to find ways to make this to get things to work. All right. So here we are to look at what are some of these strategies that different institutions, organizations, countries are dealing with to try and get tourism restarted. So look, over the last 9 weeks, we've been talking about the challenging times, the challenging issues that the different countries have been facing. Let's take a step back and just look at the overall situation. So it's worth perhaps reflecting on the fact that so much of what's happened recently has been really quite painful. Already, although these lockdowns have been very painful for business and have been quite debilitating for tourism, the reality is it does look like it's saved many millions of lives in terms of the clampdowns that we've seen. And if you look across different countries, you can begin to see the numbers in terms of outbreaks. But also what's quite telling is if you break those numbers down and to look at those within particular countries. And clearly we're now seeing some major outbreaks happening in South America, and as I'll show later, also happening in the Middle East. So some of the data is now showing that in fact we're getting more infections in different countries. India suddenly spiked up this week. Other parts of the world, we're beginning to see things settle down. But a couple of warnings, as you can see in the text what I put there, is that there's a real risk if mobility goes back up, there could be a second wave coming in the next month or so. So whilst everyone's very keen, particularly in Europe and in our region here, Asia, to get things moving, we've got to be concerned. Okay, let's look at how businesses have dealt with that. Well, perhaps one of the glue businesses is travel agencies. Flight Centre is an international travel agency group based in Australia. It was started in the UK, but it's got operations in many, many different countries. So their reality is they've laid off 6,000 staff. They've shut down over nearly close to half their Australian operations, over half their international operations. But as the CEO, Screw Turner, said, he said, you know, this is going to happen over the next 12 to 24 months. And he said, we're going to have further outbreaks. And if you don't accept that, you're kidding yourself. So his key message, though, in what he has been saying, is that you've got to convince holidaymakers and corporate clients it's safe to travel. And that's going to be a key bit of my message today. It's about safety and building confidence of people that it's okay to travel again. So if you look back at the airlines, for example, Qantas has now been looking at their way forward. As I said, people want to fly. When they surveyed people, and this was back in April, they said 85% said they're keen to travel again. So getting people interested in travel doesn't seem to be the battle. The battle is building the confidence. And as he said, we can't take the brakes off too early. And as in many countries, it's going to be domestic tourism that starts first before international gets there. So Australia is first of all talking to New Zealand, and this is where the concept of travel bubbles has come up. And what we're now seeing is that a number of different countries are looking at how you can start these travel bubbles. But again, one of the underlying issues here is that issue of confidence. In other words, and as my former colleague at Southern Cross University in Australia mentioned, he said, whether people will be willing to risk travel if their travel insurance doesn't cover them. So again, this comes back to this confidence issue. And today I'm going to look at how some countries and airlines are dealing with that very tricky issue. Now, the pain is still going to be there for a while. And New Zealand recently went out and said, basically, they've got a 100-day plan for their COVID. So, you know, that's over the next couple of years. And, you know, they've realized they're going to have to shrink in size. And they reckon they're going to lose probably about a third of the size of their airline. So these are some of the painful decisions that are having to be made by airlines. But it comes back again to that key word, confidence. So if we look at the work that IATA did, looking at restoring passenger confidence, basically what they saw from that and their recommendation was that governments and industry must start with confidence boosting measures. It is safe to travel. So in many countries where there's been very high infection rates and people know people who have had COVID, have died from COVID, then it's going to be quite challenging in those markets to say to people, it's okay. because people are naturally going to be very wary. So let's have a look about, as I said, what's happened. So the good news in the last week has been New Zealand has declared itself COVID-free. And in fact, the other bit of good news is there's several other places which are able to report that they've got no cases and are COVID-free, such as Fiji, which again is a very major tourism destination, as well as some less known places such as Eritrea and Montenegro. But many of these on that list are actually very, very well-known tourism destinations, such as the Seychelles, St. Kitts and St. Nevis. So highly dependent. Of course, many of them are islands. And in fact, if we look at other countries which have not had any COVID cases at all, again, most of them are islands. So again, these destinations are keen to re-engage, but are also very wary that they don't need to bring those infections. So this is the tension point that we're seeing for tourism and how we're going to start opening things up again. So this week, we've got a fairly major, the start of the Hajj. Unfortunately, Saudi Arabia has just announced its highest level of infections, over 100,000, with the death toll climbing to over 700. And so the number of daily infections has jumped over 3,000. So they've had to make a very challenging decision, which has been to shut down Jeddah, which is the gateway. Now, normally the Hajj brings in about 2.5 million tourists over a very short period of time. So this, you can begin to see now the challenges of these spikes and reinfections that, and second waves potentially that are coming. And we're seeing that even here where I live in Malaysia. So these are the data from Malaysia. And as you can begin to see there, our overall trend line has been down. But you can see on that far right-hand side there, the spikes that we've seen here in early June, where our number of infections have jumped. They were related to a couple of incidents. So the challenge now is for a lot of countries is how do you make sure that doesn't happen? How can you contact trace, which is what we've discussed in other webinars about what's possible. So the good news was for us here in Malaysia that we, as in many other countries, they're releasing the brakes for domestic travel. But the government has made it very clear that if there's a surge in cases, they are going to have a clampdown. So they will enforce enhanced restrictions again. And this is the challenge that we're seeing across the region. So let's look in Vietnam. Now, a few weeks ago, I spoke about them because of their campaign, and their domestic campaign is called Safe Vietnam Tourism. They've already started domestic flights, and they're now looking at how they can start to open up internationally. So their strategy is quite interesting. What they're looking at doing is identifying one particular place in the country to trial this. And they're looking at the island of Phu Quoc, which you can see on the right-hand map, is over by the Cambodia border. And their strategy is to look at taking one place to see if they can bring in tourists safely from other countries that have got low or no COVID infections as a way of restarting their tourism just to see what happens. But as the minister there said, you know, we have to take in the risk of community transmission. And Vietnam's had no deaths from COVID. So that's something they're very proud about and something they wish to maintain. And of course, jokingly, of course, and somewhat, you know, there is what's called the Corona Resort and Casino on this island as well, which only opened up in April last year. So, you know, again, we've seen Corona beer out of Mexico announce that they've had to slow production because no one's buying their product. So probably rather unfortunately named for their sole casino for domestic tourism on that particular island. Thailand next door, again, is looking at amazing trusted Thailand. So they've tweaked their campaign and their plan is to start opening up with safe havens and again, travel bubbles. So the government announced this week that they will start up those travel bubbles and they're going to do that with countries that they've got agreements with. Now, interestingly, at the moment, no countries have actually signed up for that. But that's where you can see Thailand is taking this, and they're looking to assess other countries. And word is that they're looking very closely at South Korea, at China, which has been a major source of market for tourists coming into the destination. But as the Prime Minister said, we don't want to allow total free movement yet because the outbreak could hurt both the origin and the destination. So as with the situation in Vietnam, how do you manage that? Now, other countries are going for a price approach. So Japan last month unveiled that it was going to give discounts, 50% discounts to tourists. Obviously, they were supposed to have the Olympics. They've been building a lot of infrastructure, and suddenly that's all stopped. So they're going with a way wanting to trying to rapidly increase number of tourists. Over in Europe, Slovenia has decided to give its citizens 200 euros each. Now, again, this is only for domestic travel, but a way of getting people to start traveling again. We're in economically tight times, so how can people do that? Greece, meanwhile, is now looking to open up on, I think it's the 15th of June, and they're looking to ease their travel restrictions. And, they said it's about safety, credibility, and health. So again, some key words as you can hear coming out again. And again, they're also looking at that along with some discounts. So their strategy has got two parts to it. Whereas very interestingly, what we're seeing happening in Italy, which again was very badly hit, they're going again in the island of Sicily. So again, it's an island situation where they're offering some very major discounts, 3 nights trip for free, 2 nights on a 6-day trip, vouchers, etc. But as again, they're saying that you have to get the balance between safeguarding health and restarting economic life and tourism. And this takes us to Cyprus. Now, Cyprus has taken an interestingly bit of a different tack here. They've actually guaranteed they will look after you if you catch COVID on your holiday. And they said they will pay the medical bills. So this has been quite interesting that that's their approach. So they've actually identified 112 ICU beds in a hospital, and they've got over 200 respirators there. And they've even set aside a separate hotel so that if anyone does catch COVID, your immediate family members can also be put up and they'll get you home. So they've gone very hard on this. It's safe to come here, and we guarantee that. And this has been a big factor, particularly from other countries. So Germany did a massive repatriation. Close to 200,000, I believe, Germans were repatriated by the German government. Now, the German government has now said, we will not bring you home if you get COVID. So they said, we did it once, we're not going to do it again. So Lufthansa has had to step into this breach and guarantee that if you get COVID, they will fly you home. So that's the guarantee they put you back. We will guarantee to get you back to Germany. So you can see different ways that both the tourism industry and airlines or destinations and the industry is finding ways to guarantee. So even if you get COVID when you're overseas, Lufthansa will get you back if you fly with them. So you can begin to see now what's happening. And again, AirAsia, with more regional flights, they're saying that if you get caught here, they will find ways that you don't have to pay to change your ticket to get back. So that if you see a spike and you say, no, I'm wary about going there, you can easily change yourself. Last but not least, this brings us on to the cruise ship industry. We did a special about cruise ships a couple of weeks ago. Many people were interested in that and asking us when a cruise is starting again. The due date for Australia is September the 17th now. But the question is again, how do you restart that? Some destinations are beginning to say, yes, we want cruise ships to come back. But as the cruise industry said, is to get our standards to a new level and to make sure we've got those necessary plans in place to make sure people's health and safety is being taken care of. So they're going with a big advertising campaign. It's called Remember the Future. This is by Oceanic, and they're just launching that this week. So you can begin to see that they're getting back into the market to get those people who wish to recruise. And it's a very loyal segment of cruisers. Finally, what's happening in Europe is about borders and who can travel. And as we can see here, the European Union is beginning to open those up. It's a bit of a messy situation with the coordination, to be fair, but slowly different countries are now opening up those different borders. And you're seeing that not only happen in Europe, and you can begin to see different countries. And this map shows which countries are opening up to different countries. So it's beginning to happen, and over the next couple of months, we're going to see a lot more of that happen. But again, one step forward, one step back. So in the case of the UK, they decide in the middle of the borders opening in Europe to bring on a 14-day quarantine. which has been in place in Australia for a long time and in other countries. So the airlines are now suing the British government. So you can begin to see the challenges that's happening, but which is interesting because its UK infection rates are very high. So you'd think that other countries would be more concerned about taking British tourists. All right, I think that hopefully has given you a good overview of what's happening across Europe, across the world, across Asia. Obviously, to finish off, there's a few implications. And again, every time I do this, I like to say, what's the takeaway here? 4 takeaways. It's about health and sanitation. It's going to be about using technology to track tourists to make sure that people are healthy and that you know if you're going to get an outbreak. It's about marketing. It's getting the message out there. And it's about building confidence because consumers need reassurance that it's safe to travel again. So that's all from me this week. Alan, over to you. And I think that'll segue into what's happening with the restaurant industry.
Yeah, thanks very much, Perry. And some very, very interesting points that you make there. And I guess there's this nexus of we open up the travel industry whilst as you mentioned earlier in your presentation, you've still got growth rates around the world. Some countries increasing, and infection rates increasing in many parts of the world, and yet the travel tourism industry is trying to open in amongst all of that.
Absolutely, and this is the tension that we're seeing, and this is the tension we're going to keep on seeing around the world at the moment as this happens. And again, as different countries get more on top of COVID, and other countries are finding they're going to get a second wave. There's been talk of that in Iran, for example, at the moment. So these are some of the challenges.
Thank you very much. And on that note, everybody, let me get into my presentation. And I guess I want to once again say thanks to all the students for joining us. And I saw some good numbers coming through, people registering a little late, but welcome to one and all. I'm going to share with you a little bit today about how Australia as a case study is moving to reopen the economy after the restrictions of lockdown, and hopefully give you some practical insights into what the hospitality industry is doing here in Australia. And my presentation is 3 steps Australia reopening hospitality post-COVID-19 lockdown. I've also taken a little bit of time in the last few days to interview a few restaurateurs, and later in the presentation, I want to share with you some of the tips that they've given me that they've implemented, or those tips that they're actually required to do in order to reopen their restaurants in a post-lockdown environment. But for those of you that are joining us for the first time, I'm speaking to you from Perth, Western Australia, and as has been normal for my presentations for some time now, here's a little bit of Tourism Australia again, or one of the reasons you'd want to travel to Australia in the future. And this is a picture of what I believe is one of Australia's most unique roads, the Air Highway, which crosses across the Nullarbor Plain, which is the centre of Australia, from east to west. The road travels for 1,256 kilometres. And yes, if you ever do come to Australia and you decide to drive across the country, watch out for the kangaroos. So Australia has been considered one of the countries that's managed to contain and control the spread of the coronavirus. And recently, the Australian government announced a 3-step strategy for COVID-safe Australia as it looks to reopen the Australian economy. So why has Australia been relatively successful so far in flattening the curve? And you can see by the graphs there that Australia and Thailand and Taiwan and Cambodia, and there's a number of other countries, but those are just a few of the examples of some of the countries that have been relatively successful in flattening the curve to date. Well, Australia is currently ranked number 65 in the world with 102 deaths, 6,703 people recovered, and 454 active cases. So in general, this is seen as somewhat of a success, given that there is a continued spread of the virus in many other countries. Whilst it's a little bit too early to say scientifically why Australia's managed to flatten the curve and get the virus under control, I'm sure that future research will provide us some better answers than what we currently have. But let me give you some of my views. I believe that Australia is a very large country. It is the largest country in Oceania and the world's 6th largest country by total area. And to give you an idea, it takes me roughly 4 hours and 5 minutes to travel from Perth to Sydney. That's about the same time as it takes to fly from Manila to KL, or 4 hours and 25 minutes to fly from Perth to Brisbane. So it's a vast, large country. Australia also has a relatively small population with low density living, and the population of Australia at the moment is about 25.5 million people, with an average of about 3.2 people per square kilometre. And I guess this makes us a little bit different to many other countries as well. So this low density generally means people may have less contact than in more densely populated countries. And I think that's one of the reasons. In addition, Australia generally reacted very quickly to the coronavirus. And there's a quick summary that I'll give you of some of the timelines. So the first case of coronavirus was reported in Melbourne on the 25th of January. And day one of lockdown was Friday, the 13th of March. There was a short time between then and there, but I think most countries also experienced that delay. On day one of lockdown, the 13th of March, Formula One Grand Prix, or the Grand Prix in Melbourne, was cancelled due to, and this is the first major event in Australia to be cancelled due to coronavirus in Australia. And then 2 days later, quarantine rules were broadened, with all international traveller arrivals required to self-isolate for 14 days. And we've actually had self-isolation, as Perry mentioned in his presentation, for some time now. 3 days later, on day 6, travel advice was upgraded to level 4, which is the highest level that we have in Australia, where the Australian government basically said to the Australians, do not travel. On day 7, however, Australia had its first significant outbreak. The Ruby Princess, which has been mentioned in our cruise ship presentation, arrived in Sydney Harbour, and within a period of 5 weeks, at least 662 passengers had tested positive, and 21 will have died. And on day 8, the next day, a ban on outdoor gatherings was refined to include a requirement of 4 square metres of space per person, and restaurants would have to adapt to this change pretty well immediately. However, it should be noted that within 2 days of that decision being made, the hospitality industry had effectively been brought to a standstill, and Australia started to look like it never had looked before. And I'm sure everybody is familiar with some of those rather unusual and airy sites, and that would apply to you in your own country, where airports, beaches, famous sporting grounds, venues, all being shut with nobody in them, and rather unusual sites that coronavirus has brought about throughout the world. On day 10, empty restaurant tables started becoming the norm in Australia as we went into partial lockdown in a bid to limit the spread of the coronavirus, with pubs, clubs and restaurants and cafes forced to close. But 1 day later, on day 11, the first major round of closures, where all pubs, clubs, cafes and restaurants were forced to close, excluding takeaways. So restaurants and cafes were only permitted to run takeaways and home delivery services. And on Friday, the 8th of May, this is now some 57 days later, I'm jumping forward. This is when the Australian government has finally put out some guidelines and a framework to bring Australia out of the lockdown periods. The Australian government announced a 3-stage plan to ease the coronavirus restrictions across the country. And the slide there gives you a glimpse of the master roadmap for Australia. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but you'll see that each of the industries or the major industries being affected are listed there, including the restaurant industry. And I'm going to speak to you a little bit about that in a moment. So what does this all mean for the hospitality and tourism industry? Well, despite the announcements on Friday, the 8th of May, the industry obviously take coronavirus seriously. The Australian people have generally taken coronavirus very seriously. So most of the states across Australia did not implement stage 1 or step 1 until after the 18th of May. In New South Wales, there were a few states that might have done a few days earlier, but generally it wasn't until about that time that stage 1 kicked into place. This again indicates that Australians were taking the whole program and the dangers seriously. Cafes and restaurants were allowed to seat 10 patrons at a time, as long as they followed the 4 square metre rule per person, and food courts were to remain closed. But generally now, opening the restaurant industry means that all staff must be trained in COVID-19 hygiene safety training courses before they can return to work. And there's a number of now COVID-19 training courses that are available throughout Australia, being run by the Restaurant and Catering Industry Association or the Hotels Association. And the courses cover understanding COVID-19, reporting of personal health issues, maintaining personal and work environments, contactless procedures and reducing cross-contamination, and effective cleaning and sanitizing procedures. And a lot of these things we've been speaking about over the past 8 or 9 weeks now in the 30-minute talk presentations. In addition to the staff training, however, there are also a number of practical tips being used by the restaurateurs, and I mentioned to you that I spoke to a few, and this is what they're doing to open their businesses. So first of all, they must have developed a COVID safety plan, and this is a requirement by the government. So they must have a whole range of mechanisms in place to show how they're going to open and how they're going to operate, maintain in a safe workplace. So they must implement and maintain hygiene and frequent cleaning schedules. That is a requirement. They must complete and display a COVID safety certificate, which means that they need to display that signage to indicate the maximum number of people that they can allow into the restaurant. They must carefully manage waiting areas and ensure physical distancing of 1.5 metres per metre, sorry. And generally most restaurants have mark in the ground, and they put in signage and markings at the entrances and the exits of the restaurants to remind people of that physical distancing. Most of them have installed hand sanitizers at the entrance to the restaurants and in the restaurants as well. And bookings generally are being made at the moment with non-refundable deposits to secure the patronage, and that limits their exposure for people making bookings and no-showing. And on the 31st of May, step 2 really kicked in because Australia's managed to maintain that flattened curve. And on the 31st of May, because of the low infection rates, almost no new cases being reported across Australia. We moved from step 1 into step 2, and the restaurants and pubs could now seat 20 diners at any one time, and they could allow for as long as they continue to allow for the 4 square metres per person rule. All patrons must be seated. There's no bar service and no buffet service, table service only. Restaurants must maintain attendance records of all the patrons, so they need to record who's coming into the restaurant for the purposes of contact tracing. And staff can use face masks, but it's not mandatory across all the restaurants. Some of the restaurants are now not only washing and polishing their cutlery and crockery, but they're also sanitizing it and wrapping it into paper bags or into containers. And they put that onto the cutlery onto the table in those containers or in those bags. There's certainly no cutlery stations allowable in restaurants at the moment. Restaurants are using disposable paper menus, as well as not only the use of the menu, they're reducing the number of items on the menu, so that they've also got a lower food cost throughout a time when they've got reduced patronage. Drink service is restricted to table service with minimum contact from staff, and regular and strict cleaning between customers. So that includes the sanitization of tables, chairs, and any other contact points that guests come into contact with. So you'll see people will get up, staff will come straight to the table, clean the tables and chairs, make it ready for the next set of guests. If only 2 people, if you're in a group of 6 and 2 people out of the 6 leave, then nobody else can join that group of 4 that's at the table until all 4 leave and the table's re-cleared, and then somebody else can go back and sit there. And something we've spoken about previously, and the technology component, is that payments are at the table only. Most restaurants now will not allow you to go up to the cashier's desk. They bring over a cashless payment machine to your table, and you make cashless payments at the table.
Well, pubs, cafes and restaurants are busily preparing to welcome back customers from tomorrow. Carrie-Anne Greenbank's on Chapel Street tonight. Carrie, you are at the restaurant that'll be the first to reopen in Victoria.
Well, that's right, Alicia. We're here at Cafe Kachina, which will be the first to reopen because it is reopening at midnight sharp. Right across the state today, pubs, cafes and restaurants were all preparing to reopen tomorrow, but with some very big changes. At Carlton and United Breweries, the kegs are once again pumping along conveyor belts after an 8-week shutdown.
Good afternoon, Glen Free Hotel. How can I help you?
Bookings for tomorrow are filling fast, but dining in won't be what it was. For a venue with the capacity of 500, only 77 patrons will be allowed inside to abide by the new requirements. Customers will be handed disposable menus and told not to stand at the bar.
You have to be seated at your table. We can only take bookings up to 6 people. You can't stand at the bar and drink. You have to have a meal.
Across the state, every patron at pubs and restaurants will have to provide their name and number for contact tracing. At the Auburn Hotel, they can scan in.
What this allows us to do is us to actually log people into the venue so we know who's been in the venue at each time.
Many business owners say the current restriction of 20 people per space won't turn a profit, but it will get hundreds of staff back to work. Venues are being warned police still have the power to issue hefty fines.
Significant penalties. They're close to $10,000 for on-the-spot fines. For someone who's taken to court, it's $100,000, so very significant penalties.
Baristas at the Studley Park Boathouse not just touching up on hospitality skills, but their social distancing policies as well. Some venues coming up with innovative ways to add some atmosphere. Shanika's restaurants filling their empty seats with a few good conversation starters.
We want to give people a laugh, we want to serve them, we want to welcome them back.
Easing patrons into eased restrictions.
Your cocktails, Mr. President?
Well, there's some novel ways of the ways in which the restaurant industry is looking to reopen or is reopening at the moment. And I guess some slightly better news for Western Australia. On the 6th of June, the West Australia introduced phase 3 of the opening, and the 4 square metre rule has now been revised to 2 square metres per person for all WA venues. So physical distancing, good hygiene, and the 2 square metre rule apply to all restaurants and bars, which really means that we get into a stage of normality, although more of a normality, I should say. It's certainly not normality, where we're starting to see visitation back into the restaurants and the bars. So there's a little bit of a view of what restaurants and bars and the hospitality industry is doing here in Western Australia. And I hope this gives you some idea of, and some thoughts about what the restaurants and the industry might do in your country as things start to soften and start to improve in the country, if it hasn't already. And on that note, I look forward to answering some questions together with my colleagues Perry and Andy. So thanks for the time.
Thanks very much for that, Alan. That was great. Really gives a bit of an idea. And so it's so easy to have a couple of presidents now in your restaurant. So that's a very straightforward way of doing things. So very easy way to have famous people all around your restaurant. I mean, I've seen this in lots of other countries. I think in Bangkok, they had panda bears or something, and different countries seem to be using mannequins and other things. But again, it's an innovative, different way of starting to look at how we seat our guests.
Absolutely. And as I hope we presented in the presentation, there's a number of ways that restaurants are looking at it, but certainly introducing new talking pieces is one way that I think some of the restaurants are finding quite successful.
Yeah, as I think we're seeing in the wider tourism, it's about building confidence, but you've got to back that up with safety. You've got to be able to walk your talk. And I think this is a big issue going to be for the industry. You can come up with a great marketing campaign, glossy pictures, as I showed there from Oceanic Cruises. The reality is going to be, are people going to trust you? And have you got the necessary steps in place across your entire chain of operations to make sure, whether it's your check-in, whether it's your room, hotel room or cruise ship room, whether it's the food and beverage, is being adequately sanitized and healthy, and those, you're on top of all those things.
Absolutely.
And yeah, Perry and Alan, thank you for those comments. We have a very interesting question from Chang Lee. And she's thanking us for all the information that you provided, but she had a very good question. Are there any measures that get good feedback by the tourists so far? So is there anybody doing anything that really works well?
Well, look, if I'm from a tourism point of view, I think it's still probably pretty early days at the moment. I think restaurants are able to get much faster feedback. Some of the destinations I was talking about, that's really not even happening yet. You're seeing Greece, for example, they don't even open up until sort of mid-June. So at the moment, I'm not seeing a lot of feedback that's immediately coming through. I think for the limited number of flights that are coming, are traveling, at the moment, there's been a lot of social distancing simply because there's not a lot of people about. And I think, again, it's been at different airports, making sure that the things we've talked about in past webinars about social distancing, sanitation, have all been put in place. That's all I'm hearing back so far. Alan, how about you with restaurants in WA?
Yeah, I think in the food industry, Perry, and it's a good question. Thank you very much. As Perry said, the restaurants can generally gather that data a lot quicker. I know for a fact, one of the comments from a restaurateur that I spoke to last night said to me that restaurants are taking this seriously, and that if they demonstrate to their customers that hygiene and health and safety is important to them, as it is extremely important to their customers, and they can demonstrate that, then generally they're finding that the patronage to the restaurant is good. People are not only happy to sit there, but also happy to recommend their restaurant to friends and so on. So those restaurants that may not take it as seriously as what we've tried to demonstrate through the last number of weeks, I think those are the ones that are going to be suffering.
Actually, I like the one where you mentioned, Alan, where they have a sign at the front door saying, these are the things that we do here to protect you. At least the customer, when they're walking in, they can actually visually see that these are 5 things that we do here. And when they go in, they get more confidence to see that they're actually being implemented. And that's going to help build that trust and confidence that Perry was talking about.
That's right. I think also, just to go back to, talking points and using mannequins at empty seats and so on, because there was a conversation about, do we get those tables and chairs out of the restaurants? Well, if you do, then how does a customer know that you're actually making that extra space? It's probably better to leave them there, but make good use of them. And another thing that restaurants generally have problems with is most restaurants, as we all know, have got very limited space, very limited storage space. So what do you do with all those chairs and tables if you move them out of the restaurant? Where do you put them? And how long do you move them to storage if you're going to do that? So yeah, there's some good innovative ways that are coming out of it.
Well, things are changing so quickly. Every day the rules change. So leaving tomorrow the count may go up from 10 to 15, the day after for 20. So I hope that it'll open up relatively quickly rather than taking chairs away. So that's a good point.
Yeah, I think, as you pointed out there, one of the challenges for the industry is going to be as rules have been lessened in areas. And once people start traveling, this is going to get a bit frustrating. I know even with some Australian states, there have been different rules. In the UK, you've got different rules between England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And once you start magnifying that, and we start getting a lot of people traveling again, it's going to be very challenging to keep reinforcing what's okay in one place is not okay in another place, simply because of the infection levels may be higher. And therefore, other issues are coming into play about different areas. And I think this is going to be one of the ongoing challenges because as we begin to see here, it's very hard to give absolute rules. There's been lots of discussion about should you wear face masks, should you not? It's been said that, one of the reasons that Vietnam was quite well protected was because so many people have always worn them quite frequently when on motorbikes, etc. So it was not a difficult thing for people to do, whereas in other countries, particularly in Western Europe, where face masks were unusual, it's been much harder to get that. So I think these are going to be challenges for the industry because we're going to start, as things reopen, bringing people in from different countries again, different traditions, different ways of doing things, and getting that norming in behavior is going to be quite tricky.
Absolutely. There's a good question there from Christina as well, Andy. Dr. Andy, did you?
Actually, the question that Christina asked, what organization is taking the lead in recovery efforts post-COVID? Is it the government? Is it industry? Or is it somebody else? And are they enough? What would be your wish list for the top 2 things that who's gonna fix all these problems?
Well, certainly from an Australian perspective, I think the Australian government has taken an absolutely, a major lead in the whole thing, and it's a serious thing right throughout the country, and with every Australian citizen. But then I think every industry, generally, there's institutions in Australia that are organisations that are taking the lead, and in Australia, for example, in the hospitality and tourism industry, we've got the Australian Hotels Association and the Restaurant and Catering Industry Association. So it's generally those two that are taking the lead about looking at the health department, looking at the policy, and then setting up a whole range of guidelines for the industry.
Yeah, and I think in different countries this will be challenging because again, health departments, to be fair to them, have largely their involvement in hospitality and tourism has generally been about kitchen safety. And once you bring this into consumer behavior, you're in a whole different world. So when you come up with absolute rules about social distancing and so forth, and you know, I went out to a restaurant the other day, and I was told my wife and daughter that we couldn't sit together because we weren't adequately socially distanced. Now we'd just driven in for 45 minutes together in a car there. So you've got these blanket rules which clearly don't make sense. Now other people could have showed up and not known each other and just been free friends, where you do want people socially distanced. So it's very hard to get the nuance between the rules, and I think these are the frustrations that the industry is going to find. You're going to get a lot of frustration when customers are coming up like I did, and I said, well, we've been sitting in a car for 45 minutes. If we've given COVID to each other, we've just done it already. Why can't we sit together? No, that's the rule. You've got to be X number of space apart. So this is where it's going to get frustrating, and this is where management, and I must say credit to the manager of the restaurant we were in there, managed to step into the situation and was very adept at being able to deal with this. And that's where, again, we've talked about in past webinars about what can be automated and what cannot. What he did could not be automated. He managed to see the situation and solve it there and then. So I think that'll put a lot of pressure on managers and staff in operations.
Okay, and I think we're going to ask for closing comments from each of you so that we can close up today's program. Alan, why don't you start?
Yes, thanks, Dr. Andy. And I know that quite a number of the students are away from campus at the moment. So, whilst not everybody's at campus, thank you again to those people that have joined us for today for the 30-minute talks. And I'm hoping that some of the ideas that we've given in terms of what the restaurant industry and how they're complying with the steps that the government has introduced, but also how I think restaurants themselves are looking at ways in which they can grow their business or deal with their business in the current restrictions. Take some of those ideas, maybe talk about them amongst yourselves, see how they might apply or not apply in your own country, if that may be. And hopefully that'll put you one step ahead of colleagues or friends that may not have attended and listened to us and may not have the same ideas that we shared with you. So thanks for listening, everybody, and we look forward to another week.
Great. Thanks, Alan. Perry?
Yep. Well, I just said things are going to be unfolding. They've been changing. When we started this a couple of months ago, we didn't know where things were going to be now. And I think if we look forward 2 months more, things will be different again. And it's staying ahead of where things are at, but it's also been, as Alan pointed out there, sharing information, being on the front foot. And I think, again, the hospitality and tourism industry needs to be on the front foot. So back to Tina's question there, again, we shouldn't always be at the receiving end of this. We need to show our customers that we are looking after them, we're building confidence, and that means us being on the front foot. Not just trying to turn everything back to December 2019. We need to come up with other innovative new ways of doing things. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Perry. A round of applause for our two speakers today. And again, let me conclude our program by starting to talk about our survey, which we always require everyone to participate in. And I have just posted the link in the chat room for everyone to use that. I'll do that again a couple of times. And again, get that survey done before Friday. The certificates we've been doing very well. People are very happy with our certificates, and we thank LPU for their support for sending out those certificates and logging them to make sure that they are official. And that's a great product from the result of this program. Our academic partners, LPU, University of Santo Tomas, Macau Tourism and Hospitality Association, and our friends at the International Master's Program at Kaohsiung University. Those are all great. And again, we always like to give a little prelude. And based on the survey, while you guys were doing it, I the survey results came that all three of those topics were very popular. And so since I lived in Las Vegas for over 20 years, I've decided that Las Vegas will be next week's topic. And we are trying to get a speaker from Las Vegas. We're trying to confirm that and hope to have a guest speaker from Las Vegas who will give us an update what's happening there now. But Las Vegas is a unique destination. It's one of the top tourism destinations in the world, and one of those places that everybody is aware of. So from the Philippines, this is Dr. Andy signing off and saying goodbye. Alan?
Yes, thanks everybody. Goodbye. Keep safe.
And likewise from Sunway University in Malaysia. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in future webinars. Bye for now.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week at 30-Minute Talks. Have a good weekend.